Everyone, how are you doing? It's almost the new year, so we're making lots of reading plans for the new year, and as many of you probably know, I mainly read new fiction that comes out, so I like to set myself a challenge at the beginning of the year to read some classics that I've always been meaning to get to or been wanting to reread for quite a long time. And at the beginning of last year, I set myself the challenge of 19 classics for 2019, and I didn't quite manage to read all of those, but I read some of them, and it's fun to set yourself goals. So I'm setting myself the even bigger goal of reading 20 classics in 2020. So I'm going to talk about all of those, and I like to have a reason to motivate me to finally get to these classic books. I mean, you don't need a reason to read a classic or reread a classic, but I find it a good motivation to, actually sit down and read it rather than just letting it sit on my shelf for ages and ages. So a lot of these books have special anniversaries attached to them, either since their first publication or the author has an anniversary around it, or there's a new film adaptation of these books. And I'm one of those people that always likes to read the book before going to see the film. So I want to do that with a number of these books because some of these upcoming films sound really good as well. So let me know if you're interested in reading any of these books as well, or if you've read any of them, what you think about them, if which ones you think I should prioritize and get to. So the very first novel I want to talk about has a special anniversary attached to it, and it is 75 years since the publication of Evelyn Waugh's novel Brideshead Revisited. So this was first published in 1945 and is about its protagonist Charles Ryder, who befriends a wealthy English family and goes to live with them on their mansion estate called Brideshead Castle, and his romantic entanglements with two members of that family named Sebastian and Julia. And I think that sounds like a really intriguing story. And there was an 11-part miniseries based on this novel in 1981, which was filmed at the real stately home called Castle Howard in North Yorkshire. And there's going to be a special festival coming up in the summer for this over the weekend of June 27th and 28th. There's going to be a weekend-long celebration about this novel at Castle Howard itself, which featured in the miniseries, and it's going to be celebrating the miniseries too. And there's going to be talks with members of the cast from that series, as well as literary figures, and there's going to be special exhibitions and tours of the grounds of the estate, and there's going to be a lavish party in the house itself. So that all sounds really exciting and fun, and a good motivation to finally read this novel and finally see the miniseries, because I've never seen the miniseries either, but I know it's supposed to be really good. So I think it'd be a really fun thing to read the book and then watch the series and then go to this big weekend-long celebration in North Yorkshire. And that's a part of the country that I've been wanting to explore a lot more, because a few months ago I went to Bronte country up there for the very first time and went to the parsonage and all of that. And it's such a beautiful area of the country. And looking at pictures of Howard Castle, it looks really gorgeous. So I'd really like to go to this festival in June, and I'll put details and links to it below in case you want to join, because it'd be really fun to have a meetup there over the weekend. So let me know if you get tickets or if you're interested in going in the comments below. And like I said, it's not until the summertime, so there's plenty of time to read the novel before that, or reread the novel if you've read it before. And I've read some of Waugh's fiction before. I love his novel Vile Bodies and A Handful of Dust, two really great novels, and so I've been really wanting to read more of his fiction, and I've heard great things about this novel. So I'm hoping to read this soon and then book for the festival itself. Then there are a number of books which have new film adaptations coming up of them. So the first is David Copperfield by Charles Dickens, and it feels like every year there's a new adaptation of a Dickens novel, but this new film sounds really good, and it's one of Dickens' novels that I've never read. So this novel was first serialized serialized in the years 1849 and 1850, and I think it's meant to contain a lot of autobiographical elements from Dickens' own life, and by many it's considered to be his masterpiece. The film is going to be called The Personal History of David Copperfield, and it's going to star actors like Tilda Swinton and Hugh Laurie and Dev Patel and Ben Whishaw, like all really great actors. There's also going to be a new film adaptation of Agatha Christie's 1937 novel Death on the Nile, and I've never read any Agatha Christie, and I know that's sort of a sacrilege in a lot of people's books, but yeah, I've just never read her, so I'd be really keen to read her fiction. And it seems like there's a lot of Agatha Christie things coming up in this new year, because there's actually two adaptations of her work. So there's a TV series adaptation of her novel The Pale Horse, but then there's also this big movie adaptation of Death on the Nile, and this is being directed and starring Kenneth Branagh, who also made Murder on the Orient Express. And with these films, these films were also made in the 70s or 80s, I think, with a big cast of really starry cast of characters, and the same is going to be true for this new adaptation. So it's going to star people like Armie Hammer and Annette Bening and Sophie Okonedo. So yeah, really interesting group of actors. There's also going to be a big new film adaptation of Jack London's novel Call of the Wild, and I've never read this book. I feel like I should have when I was like an adolescent or a teenager, but I just never got around to it. So I'd be really interested to read it now. So this is an adventure novel from 1903, which is all about the Klondike gold rushes. And the film is going to star Harrison Ford and Dan Stevens. And Dan Stevens played the lead character in the adaptation of The Line of Beauty, Alan Hollinghurst's great novel. And it was a really good adaptation too. So I'd be really keen to see this film, and of course want to read the novel first. There's also going to be a big new film adaptation of Daphne du Maurier's classic novel Rebecca, that she was first published in 1938. And I know I've been wanting to read this novel for ages and ages, and keep saying I'm gonna read it, but I really hope I can be motivated to read it this time. So I know the story basically already because I love the 1940 film made by Hitchcock, and I know it concerns an aristocratic wife who is sort of haunted in this big house by the presence of her husband's first wife. And the new film is going to be directed by Ben Wheatley, which is a really interesting choice because he's made very gritty films like Down Terrace and Kill List, and it's going to star people like Armie Hammer and Lily James and Kristen Scott Thomas. So it's another really good cast. So yeah, I'll be quite keen to see this new film, but I know I should really get around to reading the novel as well. And I have this beautiful 80th anniversary edition that Virago published a while ago. There's also going to be a new TV series of Aldous Huxley's 1938 novel Brave New World. Now this is a novel I actually have read before, but I'd be really keen to reread to see how it stands up, because I think I first read it as a teenager or late teenager, so it's been a long time, and it's about a dystopian society that has an intelligence-based social hierarchy, and it'd be really interesting to see how relevant it still is today. And there's been lots of adaptations made of this book before. So there's been a TV series of it before and a film made before, which I've never seen and I don't think is meant to be all that good. So it'll be interesting to see if the new TV series is any good as well. It was also announced really recently that the director Baz Luhrmann has acquired the rights to make a new film version of Mikhail Bulgakov's novel The Master and Margarita. So this was a novel written in the early 20th century when the author was living in the Soviet Union, and it's a satirical novel about a visit that the devil makes to the Soviet Union, which is officially an atheistic state. So it was banned for many years within the Soviet Union itself, and I don't think it was published as a proper novel until the year 1967. And Baz Luhrmann obviously makes very lavish productions of classic films like the Great Gatsby. So I'll be really interested to see what he makes of this. And it sounds like a really like curious, like fun story. And it's been a novel that I've always been interested in reading. And just like it seems that there's always a new film adaptation of a Charles Dickens novel, it always seems like there's a new film adaptation of a Jane Austen novel. And in 2020, there's going to be a new film of her 1815 novel, Emma, which is a comedy of manners and a tale about social status. And I know a lot of you have been hounding me that Jane Austen is an author I really need to get to grips to, because it's somebody I've never really enjoyed reading all that much before. I talked about this in the classics book tag that I made recently, where I've just never really got along with her novels, but I'd be really keen to try reading her again and see if I get along with her this time. And something that makes me especially interested in this new film adaptation is that it's being co-written by Eleanor Catton, the author, Booker Prize winning author of The Luminaries. So I'm so interested to see how that's going to play out on the screen. And it's also starring Anya Taylor-Joy, who's a really good actress that was in a film called Thoroughbreds that I really loved and would recommend. But it's also going to be starring Bill Nighy. So yeah, it's going to be a film to watch. And speaking of Eleanor Catton, I'd be really interested to reread her big novel, The Luminaries, in 2020, because there's going to be a 6-part BBC Two series based on that book. And I know a lot of people probably won't count The Luminaries as a classic novel because it's only published in 2013. But, you know, I think it really is going to be a future classic. I mean, it won the Booker Prize and has been much acclaimed, and I think it's a brilliant novel. So I think it is going to stand the test of time like that. It's such a great sweeping story about a settlement in New Zealand where many locals try to make their fortunes in nearby gold fields. And I haven't read this novel since it was first published in 2013. So it's been 7 years, so it'd be really great to revisit it now before this new TV series comes out, which stars Ava Green. Then there are a couple of classic children's books I'd like to throw into the mix as well, because there's new film adaptations being made of them, and I've never read the books themselves. So the first is The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. And so this was first published in book form in the year 1911, and it has a really dark story. So it's about a young unloved girl who's raised in India, and her parents die in a cholera epidemic. So she moves to England and goes to live with an uncle who she's never met before in his mansion estate out in the countryside. And there she discovers a secret garden. And the story has a sort of gothic feel to it. And this new film adaptation of it is meant to be quite gothic as well. And it's starring Colin Firth and Julie Walters. And I hear it's really great. I think there was also a film made of it in 1993. So it's been quite a while. So it'll be interesting to see this updated version of it. There's also a new film version of Roald Dahl's 1983 novel, The Witches, which is about a boy who stumbles upon a conference of witches, which sounds like a really fun story. And I read recently some of Roald Dahl's short stories for adults, and I'd be really interested to revisit some of his children's fiction. And this is one of his books that I've never read. And this is, I think, going to be a big new film adaptation because it's being directed by Robert Zemeckis, and it's starring Anne Hathaway, as well as Octavia Spencer and Chris Rock and Stanley Tucci. I've also been wanting to get into reading some science fiction, and I think a good place to start would be with reading some classic science fiction. And I've never read Frank Herbert's 1965 novel Dune, which takes place on a desert planet where there's a fight for this precious life-extending drug. And I know a lot of people have been reading this on BookTube recently and having discussions around it and making videos around it. So I think it'd be really fun to go back and watch some of those videos after reading the novel for myself. And there's also a big new film adaptation coming of this novel, which is being directed by the same director who made the film Arrival and Blade Runner 2049. So I think it'll be really atmospheric and really big, and I think it's going to come out at the very end of 2020, so that'll give me some good time to read the book before seeing the film. And it's going to have a really amazing cast, including Timothy Chalamet and Rebecca Ferguson, Oscar Isaac and Josh Brolin, Charlotte Rampling, Jason Momoa, and Javier Bardem. So really great cast. Then there are some novels which have some big anniversaries attached to them, and it's going to be the 100th anniversary since the publication of Agatha Christie's very first novel called The Mysterious Affair at Styles. And I told you it's going to be a big year for Agatha Christie. And I've talked about before how when I go to read an author for the very first time, a classic author for the first time, I like to start with the very first book and then read some of their other novels. But I know with Agatha Christie, she's written a lot of novels. So I think a good thing might be to do is to read one of her big classic novels like Death on the Nile, and then go back and read her very first novel. And so with this novel, it was her introduction of her classic detective character of Poirot, who was a Belgian refugee of the First World War, who comes to live in Britain. And when he comes to live here in the story of the novel, he befriends a woman who helps him sort of settle into English life. And then she winds up dead, and he uses his detective skills to investigate her murder. Another classic author whose debut novel was first published in 1920 is F. Scott Fitzgerald. So his novel This Side of Paradise was first published in that year, and this the story, another story which is sort of about the lingering effects of World War One, and it's about a beautiful young student who goes to Princeton and studies literature, and so with a lot of F. Scott Fitzgerald's writing, it sort of centers around social class and aspirations like that. And this is an author that I've never really got along with that great. I mean, I enjoyed his novel The Great Gatsby, but I know for some people, this is one of, they think, the greatest novels of all time, and I just didn't feel that way. And I also read his novel Tender is the Night, which I just didn't think was that great a novel. So I'd be really interested to see what his debut novel is like. Another novel which was first published 100 years ago in 1920 is Edith Wharton's novel The Age of Innocence. Now, this is a novel I've read before, but I'd be really keen to reread. And so, and I think it's important to reread the classics as well as reading them for the very first time. And this novel I loved so much. And it's about upper class society in New York City in the 1870s, and a love triangle. And like I said before in the classics book tag, this is a film adaptation I loved so much as well. So I'd really enjoy revisiting this novel. Now, a novel that was first published 150 years ago in 1870 is Fyodor Dostoevsky's novel The Eternal Husband. And this is one of his lesser known novels, but one that I got a copy of this a few years ago, and I've always been interested to read it because it has a very intriguing plot. So it's about a man who reunites with an old friend of his, and the friend's late wife what used to be his lover, and he discovers that his friend's child is actually his child. So obviously this is a very fraught situation, very dramatic situation, and I think it is meant to have a very dramatic ending. So I'm interested to see how that plays out. Another book which is celebrating its 150th anniversary is Charles Dickens' novel The Mystery of Edwin Drood, and so this was serialized in the year 1870, but Charles Dickens died before he could finish it. He only finished about half the novel that he was planning to create, and he didn't leave any sort of big plans about how, or a sketch of a plan of how he was going to finish the novel. So people have always wondered how he was going to complete it, and I think a few authors have written potential ends to the book. But yeah, I've always been keen to read this novel because I think it's meant to be a bit gothic and sort of surreal. And I bought this edition, this classic Wordsworth edition, many years ago on sale for only £1 12 pence. So I think that's a pretty good deal. But it's crazy that Charles Dickens died when he was only 58 years old. I didn't realize that he was relatively young when he died. But yeah, so I'd be quite keen to read this. An author who was born 100 years ago is Ray Bradbury. He was born on August 22nd, 1920. And I read his novel Fahrenheit 451 before, but sort of like with Brave New World, I read it when I was a teenager and just don't remember it all that well. So I'd be keen to reread this novel, but I can't quite make up my mind about whether to reread this or to read one of his science fiction books, like The Martian Chronicles, because he's another classic science fiction writer that I should probably get to grips with if I want to get into science fiction. And an author who's going to be celebrating her 200th birthday is Anne Bronte, who was born on January 17th, 1820. And there's been a lot of talk about the Brontes in the past few years because they've all been having their 200th anniversary. And The Tenant of Wildfell Hall is a novel I've been really wanting to get to, that one that I meant to read in Victober and I just didn't get around to. And so this is a story concerning a widow who moves into Wildfell Hall, and there's a lot of gossip around her arrival there. And it's meant to be a really great novel. When I asked for suggestions of what Bronte novel I should read next, a lot of you said this novel, so it's one I'm hoping to get to in this year. And finally, a novel which has a beautiful new reprint of it is The Street by Ann Petrie. So this was first published in 1946, and I think Ann Petrie is the first African American woman to ever publish a novel which has sold over 1 million copies. It was a big sensation back in 1946, and the story concerns a single mother raising her child in Harlem in New York City during the 1940s, and about her struggles in that neighborhood at that time. And this new edition has an introduction by Tayari Jones, and it's being published by Virago Books, which is a publisher that I'm a big fan of. They republish a lot of really interesting classic books. And last year in my video about what to read in 2019, I talked about a reprint of their novel Corregidora by Gail Jones that they republished this year, and which I read and I thought was really brilliant. A really great classic that I'm surprised I had never heard of before. So it's great that they brought out this beautiful new edition of it. So yeah, the Street is one that I'd really like to get to this year. So those are all the books I want to talk about. Like I said, let me know if you've read any of these and which ones you'd be keen to read. Let me know in the comments below and we can have a chat about it. But thank you for watching and happy reading in the year 2020.